Okay friends, it's time to get started on our job. One of the first things you want to do is safely raise and support the rear of the vehicle so the wheel is off the ground. After that, we're going to go ahead and remove the center cover. You're going to find a little tab in here that you can carefully get in between and gently pry without damaging the wheel. Go ahead and pull that off of there, give it a quick inspection, set that aside. After that, you're going to continue on by removing all 5 of your 19mm lug nuts. Let's remove the wheel. Now that the wheel's off of there, we have a nice clear view of our brakes. The area that we want to pay attention to first is the caliper. We're going to come right inside this area with a small pry bar and carefully try to push this piston in. Just going to come in between the caliper and the rotor itself, and we'll gently pry. Now once that's pushed in enough that you can move this around, we can continue on by removing our 2 10mm slider pins. Alright, so now that we have that pushed back, let's move along to our 2 10mm slider bolts. Leave that in there just a couple threads. We'll grab these bolts. It's a good idea to give them a quick inspection. You want to make sure the threaded area is still in good condition. These look fine, so I'll set them aside. Let's grab onto that caliper. We're going to carefully remove it from the knuckle area. Just grab onto it. You're going to lift up on the lower aspect and kind of pivot away. Now it's time to remove the rotor. Carefully grab onto it, give it a little wiggle, and pull it off of here. I like to give them a quick inspection. Set it aside. Now we can start removing the emergency brake shoes. To do this, we're going to make our way right along the bottom. Looking at this area, you can see the adjuster cog. I'm just going to use a long flat screwdriver. Come in between the shoe and the backing plate. And now I'm going to press it up against the inside of the axle there. You can see that I can pull on this with a little bit of leverage. And now I can slide the adjuster right out of there. There's our adjuster. Go ahead and give that a quick inspection. We'll set that aside. Next, we can move along to the spring right here. You can see that it hooks in on the rearward shoe, and you can see that it hooks in on the forward shoe. We're going to go ahead and take it right off of those shoes. To do this, typically I just use some long nose pliers. I'll grab onto this, give it a little tug, and try to pull it out of the shoe. There we are. Now we can grab onto the shoe, and we're going to pay attention to the mounting points. Now for these, there's a little tab that you're essentially going to press in straight, and then if you were to look right where my index finger is, you can see a tip of a pin. That pin goes all the way through the shoe and through the other side of the backing plate. To remove these, I'm going to carefully get behind the shoe and then try to grab onto the outer aspect of that clip. Now once I've grabbed onto it, I can carefully squeeze, and now we're going to grab onto the end of that pin. We'll just go ahead and twist that so it lines up with the hole. Once it's lined up, you should be able to release the clip, and it should want to slide right out of there. Once you have it slid out of there, you can grab onto the shoe. We're just going to give it a little twist like this. We'll try to remove that clip. Watch your fingers for any pinch points. There's the clip. Release that. Do the same thing on the other shoe. For this one, I'm going to use a screwdriver. I'll go ahead and get in between the hub and the clip, gently pry, and then we'll grab the pin tip, we'll twist it until it's in position to remove it. Now let's go ahead and grab onto the shoe. We're just going to lift it up enough that we can gain access to our upper spring. For this, you can either use some cutters and carefully grab onto it, or you can just use some long nose pliers. Once the spring's off of there, carefully remove your shoe. You're going to want to give it an inspection. We'll set that aside. Let's grab onto the other side. We're going to pull this out with the spring. Let's go ahead and remove that. Set all that aside. Let's get the pins out of here. Shouldn't look like that. Let's get the other pin out of here as well. Now let's go ahead and follow that emergency brake cable to where it has a bracket that connects onto the lower control arm. We're going to use a 10mm socket to remove that mounting bolt. Quick inspection. Set that aside. Make sure the bracket's free from the control arm. Now we're going to have to go ahead and get this out of here. This comes all the way through from the rear and leads to the emergency brake cable. To pull this out of the back, I'm just going to gently pry with a small pry bar. You want to make sure that you have each one of these two ears lined up as closely as possible, so just make sure that they fit in. Once they're in there, we're just going to carefully pry and try forcing them out through the rear. Now we can grab on from the backside and we'll finish pulling it out. There's one side. There we are. Now we'll just set all this aside. Let's move along to the axle nut. For this, we're going to use a 36mm socket. Use a hammer and punch, come right in the center here and break the axle free from the wheel bearing. Once you're sure it's broken free, we can continue. Now let's remove the toe link from the knuckle. For this, there's an 18mm nut right underneath this bolt. We're going to go ahead and remove that. We'll drive the bolt up and out of here, separate the knuckle a little bit so we can remove this from the area. We'll give those a quick inspection, set them aside. The next thing you're going to want to do is use a little bit of penetrant inside the bolt hole and along this slit right here in the knuckle. After you've put a little bit of penetrant in there, continue on with some sort of chisel or even a small pry bar that you can hit up against. We're going to get right into that little groove that's in the knuckle. We'll just go ahead and separate the ears a little bit so we can get the toe link out of here. Now let's continue on by removing the upper ball joint from the knuckle. If you were to look at the forward aspect of it, you're going to find an 18mm nut. Go ahead and remove that, drive the bolt out, and then we'll start separating this. Now let's continue on with a hammer and pickle fork and separate the ball joint from the knuckle. Once this is broken free, typically I just leave it in there a little bit. Now I'm going to pause and make my way to the bottom bolt. To remove this bolt, we're going to hold the bolt side, which is on the back, with an 18mm. Once you have your wrench on there, continue on to your 21mm nut. Fully remove that, and then remove the bolt. We'll wiggle this around so we can get the bolt out of there. Inspect the bolt and the nut, put them together, and set them aside. Now at this point, we can make our way back up top. We'll go ahead and pop this up out of here. Grab onto that knuckle. We're going to pull it out. Be very careful not to damage the axle. We want to make sure that that pushes through the wheel bearing. Now we can get this over to the bench. Okay friends, let's make our way over to the press. Now what we need to do is go ahead and press the hub out of the center of the bearing. You can see this inner ring right here. So with that said, we want to make sure that we're holding the knuckle in place. Generally, you want to make sure you're into a secure point, such as maybe this area right here, and if you made your way over, along where the bottom bolt's supposed to go through. Keep in mind, you could potentially damage the backing plate a little bit. Generally, you can just bend it back in place. With that said, we'll just go ahead and take our adapter that fits right over that center hub area. I'll use another adapter here just to take up a little bit of the space, and now we're going to start driving it down. When you're doing this, you want to be very careful because we're going to be putting this under a lot of pressure, so you want to make sure you're as safe as possible. Of course, you're going to be wearing hand and eye protection at all times. You want to make sure you keep your feet out from underneath this area in case the hub comes down so it doesn't potentially hurt you. Now that we have the hub out of the bearing area, we're going to go ahead and take the snap ring out of the back side. After we have the snap ring out, we can go ahead and turn this over, and we're going to press the bearing out from the front through the back. We'll use our snap ring pliers. We're going to come into each of the two ears. Carefully squeeze this together. Now once you have it starting to come out of the groove, generally you can just grab onto it with some pliers and carefully remove it. Keep in mind, it's under spring tension. You don't want it to fly up and hit you in the face. We'll give that a quick inspection, set that aside. Now let's take the knuckle and we'll put it in the upright position, so the forward end is facing up. The next thing you're going to want is an adapter that can fit directly over this, but it doesn't necessarily hit up against the knuckle in any way. After that, I'll just use a spacer. And now we'll start compressing this down. When we do this, we want to try to make sure we're pressing it down as straight as possible. All right, go ahead and remove the bearing. We can set that aside. The next thing you want to do is clean up the hole along here where the bearing's supposed to sit. Also, you can see that there's a groove where the snap ring needs to be. go ahead and clean that out as well. Okay friend, now it's time to install our bearing into the knuckle. Now when you do this, you're going to want to make sure that you have it as flat as possible, or essentially going in a straight line all the way down and into the knuckle. To press this down, you need to do it very carefully. The only place that you can press against on this to drive it down is the very outer circle. You don't want to press on the center circle or even the inner circle. Any of that will destroy the bearing. To do that easiest, you can go ahead and use your original bearing. It's going to fit right over the top. Now we can go ahead and use our adapter and we'll press this down so we can put in our snap ring. Now what you're going to notice as you're driving this down is it seems as though it goes down very easily until it doesn't. Once it feels as though it stops going down, typically that means you're bottomed out. So at that point, you just want to give it a little bit more pressure just to make sure that you're completely seated. Then we'll release pressure, remove our original bearing, and put in that snap ring. Time for the brand new snap ring. We'll use our snap ring pliers, put them right inside those holes. We're going to line this up with the groove all the way around. Now you need to fully inspect it. As you can tell along this area right here, it's not completely seated. It's very important to make sure it's all the way around inside the groove. Tap it down. Give it a quick inspection. Now that we have the snap ring in there, let's continue on by installing the hub. To install the hub, let's go ahead and put it right on a flat surface on this area here. Now we're going to take the knuckle with the bearing, rest it over the top of this. Now that we have it in place, we're going to continue on by pressing this down. When we press it down, you can only press along the inner circle. Just find an adapter that fits right over that. Make sure it's as straight as possible. All right, so right there it feels as though it bottomed out. I'm just going to go a little bit more. Yep, that's nice and tight. Let's relieve tension. Hold onto the knuckle so it can't fall over. Let's give it a quick inspection, and now we can make our way back over to the vehicle. Okay, let's get this installed on the vehicle. Now to do this, what you want to do is line up the axle with the inside of the bearing. At the same time as lining this up, we need to make sure that we line this up as well. Put the mounting bolt in through from the rear to the front. Now that's in there, just be very careful not to let this come down and potentially damage your axle in any way. We're going to take this and we'll put the upper ball joint into the top of the knuckle. Go ahead and press that down and in and put in that pinch bolt as well. We'll put that in through from the rear towards the front. Start that nut on there. Let's start the lower nut on there as well. Now we can go ahead and take the toe link here, and we'll slide it right into its position in the knuckle. Once it's in there, go ahead and take your mounting bolt. We're going to slide this down and through. Take your mounting nut, go ahead and start it on there. Now at this point, we can go ahead and bottom out all 3 of our mounting bolts, and then we'll go ahead and torque them to manufacturer specification. Let's make our way to the top nut. Now the lower nut. For that, we're going to use our 21 and our 18. Now we can torque these to manufacturer specification. Let's torque this nut to 66 foot-pounds. We'll torque the upper ball joint pinch bolt nut to 66 foot-pounds as well. And now we can torque the lower nut to 111 foot-pounds. Let's continue on to reinstalling our axle nut. Typically, it's a good idea to go ahead and replace the axle nut. If you're not, you need to at least apply a thin amount of red thread locker to the threads on the axle. Let's take that axle nut. Now we're going to have to bottom out the axle nut with a ratchet. You never want to use an air gun because you don't want to damage the bearing. There we are. Okay, we're getting to the point that we're going to put on our emergency brake shoes. Before you do, you want to add a little bit of lubricant along all of these raised areas on the backing plate. You're going to find 3 of them along the forward side, 3 along the rearward side, essentially in the same positions. After we lubricate those, we're also going to lubricate the areas up along the knuckle where the shoes are going to sit. When you do this, you want to use high temperature caliper grease, and you also want to make sure you don't put on too much because we don't want it to get on the shoes. Now let's get the shoes in. Make sure you have them in the proper orientation. Let's take our upper spring. We're going to put it right into the upper hole. Now we can go ahead and take the spring and we're going to slide it down underneath the knuckle in between the area where the bearing and the knuckle meet. Once you have that slid in there, we're going to continue on putting on the forward shoe as well. Now what you're going to find is you have to actually grab onto the spring. You're going to stretch the spring. So keep in mind it's going to be under a little bit of pressure. And then you're going to slide it into the same hole on the forward shoe. After you have it in there, make sure you set it inside the groove. I'm going to use some cutters to grab onto the spring easiest. You just want to be careful not to go ahead and cut the spring in any way. If you try to use pliers, typically they slip a little bit. When I grab onto the spring, I'm going to use the hub as a leverage point and carefully pull. Go ahead and take that shoe. We're going to try to put the spring into its corresponding hole. Double check to make sure it's inserted in the shoe on both sides. The next thing that I like to do is just try to hold the shoe up against the backing plate. You could do that several different ways, but for me, I'm just going to use a pry bar in between the shoe and the hub itself. What you also want to pay attention to is the hole for your mounting pin. We're going to take that and put it through the back side of the backing plate, and then we can take our locking clip and put it in position and lock it down. Now, since it's going to be hard to see while it's inside the vehicle, I'm going to show you out in the open. We're going to come through the backing plate, it's going to come through the shoe, make its way through this larger hole, and then it needs to line up perfectly with the corresponding hole in the front. If you have it twisted too much, it's not going to go ahead and line up. So once you have it lined up perfectly, you can go ahead and twist this, and then you latch it in just like that. That's in its fully locked position, and it's in the safe position. With that said, let's go ahead and put it through the backing plate. To get the forward pin in, it's going to be easiest using a magnet. Let's take this and we'll put it in position through the back of the backing plate. Let's get that clip in there. Next, we're going to compress this so we can slide the pin through it. We'll go ahead and lock it in. Time for the adjuster. Add some lubricant. Go ahead and turn that all the way up. Now we can take our lower spring and we're going to put it into the 2 lower holes on each of the shoes. I'm going to stretch it up to the other shoe. Slide it right in there. Now it's time for the adjuster. Pay attention to the slots of the adjuster and make sure it lines up with the corresponding slots on the shoes. You might find that the cog of the adjuster hits up against the spring. That's okay. We're going to have to separate the shoes a little bit to get this in here. Once you feel as though you have it in there, just double check. It needs to be sitting in the shoe properly. You don't want it to fall out while you're driving down the road. We'll get the pin through there. Take our other clip, put it in position. Let's continue on by applying some copper never sees to our hub mating surface. Double check to make sure you didn't get any on your emergency brake shoes. Now it's time to install our rotor. Just carefully slide it right on over those emergency brake shoes. If it feels like it's binding, trying to go on, you need to go ahead and take it right back off. You're going to double check the emergency brake shoes to make sure they're sitting properly and the emergency brake is not in the on position. Let's take that caliper and we'll slide it right on over. You want to pay attention to the top of each of the pads. We want to make sure that the bracket slides in. If it feels like the caliper doesn't want to go on, more than likely it's due to your slider pin. You just want to carefully push that towards the inboard aspect of the vehicle. After that, let's take our 2 caliper slider bolts. We'll get those into position. Now you want to start them both in. Bottom them out. Now we can torque each of them to 24 foot-pounds. Let's go ahead and get the wheel up on here. Start on all of your lug nuts, bottom them out. We'll get the wheel back on the ground, and then we'll torque each of them to 100 foot-pounds. With the wheel back on the ground, let's torque these in a crisscross manner. torqued. Of course, if you had a center cover, go ahead and put it on now. Looking at the back, you can see the areas where all the lug nuts need to fit into. Make sure it's secure. Okay friends, we got the truck back together. What's left to do now? Now, of course, you're going to want to safely take it down to your local alignment shop and get yourself a 4-wheel alignment. Thank you for watching.